Hokey religions and ancient weapons are no match for a good blaster at your side, kid.
In the years after Star Wars' heyday was over, but before the internet began, there was a time long forgotten, when finding items that weren't made anymore was a committed and arduous search of garage sales, flea markets, searching the phone book for antique stores and comic book shops outside your area, and putting miles and miles on your car in the quest for whatever you were desperate to find. If you had an incomplete Kenner Star Wars toy collection, that search was even more egregious at first, because initially toys were not seen as adult collectibles, which means antique stores and comic book shops were not seeking them out. You were slumming it at garage sales hoping for a win, and that's if you could convince your parents to drive you to a few. So when the 1995 Power of the Force Star Wars toys came around, you can imagine the fervor not just from kids, but from collectors like myself with incomplete Kenner collections. Here was a chance to complete a range of Star Wars toys and not miss a single item. However, I quickly realized the real boon for myself within the 90s line of toys wasn't completing the range itself, as the figures weren't really compatible with the Kenner styles, but in the new releases of the vehicles, which were almost all reissues of the original Kenner designs. I didn't have a vintage AT-AT or Slave 1, and I thought I'd never acquire a vintage A-Wing, so being able to get these in slightly modified forms at retail again and for standard prices was a massive win. And they displayed perfectly well with the Kenner toys I already owned because they were from the same DNA. However, when eBay arrived, it was no longer a challenge to find original Kenner Star Wars toys, and I quickly acquired the vehicular gaps in my collection, including the highly prized vintage A-Wing. As a result, the Power of the Force versions from the 90s were slowly sold off or gifted to friends. But eventually, you complete a collection to your liking. And then you end up with three kinds of collectors. The first type is the brand orthodoxy crack addict. They have no interest in anything beyond what was made by that company in those years. These people are very boring to have conversations with 40 plus years on because they're happily stuck in a very beaten rut in the road and have next to no curiosity. They start collecting multiples, end up being focus collectors, and pay crazy dollars for prototypes and other esoteric high roller items. The second type is the collector who enjoys achieving the goal, and then immediately looks for a new range of things to collect. They have inherent curiosity and a need to keep exploring rather than stare at one shelf of items for the rest of their lives. The third type is the collector who still isn't finished with that line, even though the collection is complete. These are the people who see the gaps left by the original company for specific characters and vehicles, and they have no hesitation looking for options and ways to add to that toy range's universe through third-party creations and customs. As the years went on and I acquired Stan Solo figures and started working on custom playsets, I hadn't kept a close eye on the modern Star Wars items, and I felt like there might be opportunities there to fill the gaps in the Kenner universe of toys for my displays. But I didn't want to grab just any of the modern toys, as their detail and aesthetics, while scattershot, improved on average with each subsequent range of toys. I started at the beginning, where I found my first almost candidate, the Detention Block Rescue mini playset. Aside from the stupid superfluous cannons everywhere, the section of hallway with the camera banks, Leia's cell, and the trash compactor hatch are really well done. There's only one problem. There's nowhere to integrate this module into either version of the vintage Death Star playset. On the Kenner one, you would need to put it on a riser to one side of the first floor and then reposition the trash compactor next to it. It's a clunky solution, which is a shame as the Kenner version was sorely lacking a prison cell. The Palitoy version needs no assistance. It already has a prison cell and the chute into the compactor. Another almost contender to add to Kenner displays are the Power of the Force 3D dioramas of the Mos Eisley Cantina and Jabba's Palace. Now, if you're about to scream that the Mos Eisley Cantina already has representation in the vintage line, yes, that's true. However, with the abundance of third-party Cantina alien figures that Kenner never made, that vintage playset and the cardboard alleyway quickly run out of room. Once again, though, the problem is integrating the two sets together. There's just no easy way to do it as both are horizontal frontage and orientation, so it's an either-or situation. You either use the Kenner one, or this one, which harkens back to those equally flimsy Kenner cardstock playsets like Cloud City. A more immediately workable add-on is the Jabba's Palace diorama from the same 3D series. Admittedly just as flimsy as the Cantina, but at least it's an environment we didn't quite get with the Kenner line, and you can ditch the box throne, instead using your vintage Jabba the Hutt. From what I hear, the scaling works pretty well, with a few visual compromises, and then all of those denizens of Jabba's Palace Kenner made finally have a place to live. The detail on it threads that needle with Kenner design to the degree that it isn't so far away from vintage styling that it would jump out at you. However, I find the most seamless modern Star Wars playset with vintage Kenner is the 1997 Endor Attack playset of the Imperial Bunker from Return of the Jedi. While they have recently released a new one for the vintage collection, the latest iteration is far too detailed alongside the more simple Kenner lines, while this 90s bunker is pitch perfect and provides a badly needed location missing from the Kenner range. The bunker also looks great alongside the AT-ST, with the Endor heroes defending the doorway, and the extra tree trunk piece is perfectly styled to fit in with your Ewok village environment. Plus, the Ewoks get an additional catapult out of the bargain. I know a lot of people claim the new vintage collection bunker is superior for being larger and more detailed, but those two elements in my view mean they clash with the Kenner aesthetics. Kenner toys were scaled smaller relative to the figures, and the detailing was cleaner and more straightforward. The Endor Attack bunker checks all of these boxes. The other modern environment I almost disqualified for the reasons I outlined with the vintage collection indoor bunker is the Lars Homestead, a Toys R Us exclusive from 2008. While the Kenner range hardly underserved the Tatooine environment from the original film, most of that was devoted to Mos Eisley and not Luke Skywalker's stomping grounds. So when I learned of Hasbro's Lars Homestead, I was initially disappointed as the weathering on their stucco igloo is edging toward a detail level that is the antithesis of Kenner styling. I kept looking at it though because with the simplicity of color and shaping of the main structure, the added detail isn't as obtrusive, so I gave the playset a much closer look. To my absolute shock, I learned the base of the playset, which looks like a spilled milkshake, is a very cheap blow mold job with an interior detail that is so simplistic, I felt I was looking at something made for a 1970s toy and not a 2000s toy. In that moment, I decided the Lars Homestead playset would be perfect for a Kenner display. And I don't think I was off base. No pun intended. The Homestead even comes with a moisture evaporator, which is another simple yet essential addition to a Tatooine display, without looking too out of place among Kenner figures. Sir, I don't know where your evaporator learned to communicate, but it has the most peculiar dialect. What are you talking about? Show me. Oh, excuse me. Hello. Bonjour. And because I now had Luke's childhood home to park the land speeder and the sandcrawler next to, it also provided me the opportunity to acquire one of the earliest vehicles in the Power of the Force 2 run that wasn't a reissued Kenner vehicle. Luke's T-16 Skyhopper was finally made into a figure vehicle in 1996. I didn't pick this up back in the day because I still had gaps in my vintage vehicle collection and a limited amount of cash in high school. And because it wasn't ever utilized in the film, I put it lower on the priority list. However, George Lucas did sneak it into the production design of the Homestead's garage workroom. You can see the engine and back of the Skyhopper just outside the door of the workshop. So I displayed the T-16 behind the Lars Homestead as a nod to that general, if not exacting, geography. The nice thing about the T-16 appearing so early in the Power of the Force 2 run is Hasbro made a clear effort to give the vehicle a similar amount of sculpting to the Kenner vehicles they were reissuing so it didn't clash with the toys around it, and that makes it a perfect addition to a Kenner display. Hasbro also made the decision not to reissue a Kenner Darth Vader TIE Fighter, as they had done with the original TIE Fighter, and would go on to do with the TIE Interceptor. Instead, they made an attempt to create a far more screen-accurate Vader TIE, while keeping the details in line with the other Power of the Force 2 reissues of the Kenner vehicles. The earliest releases of this vehicle had gray missiles, like the one here, while the majority of examples had the missiles changed to green to match the TIE's laser blast color. I'm not completely wild about the design proportions of this revised Vader TIE. I think the cockpit window is too small, and the top hatch looks like the vehicle is wearing a half-cooked pancake on its head. Unfortunately, Hasbro's recent Vader TIE announcement is being sold for the extortionate price of $140. It looks great, arguably too detailed for a Kenner display, but I'd honestly prefer it over the 1990s version if it was more reasonably priced. This is why I own the 90s Vader TIE, but display the Kenner original, which I think wins the competition, as baffling as that might sound. By the time the Episode 1 era had ended, but before the release of Attack of the Clones, Hasbro bridged that gap with their Power of the Jedi line, which reintroduced original trilogy toys and roped in toys and characters from the new first prequel. And this was when Hasbro finally righted one of the most glaring Kenner omissions, the TIE Bomber from The Empire Strikes Back. Only released back then as a now super rare die-cast miniature toy, the TIE Bomber was the one major variant in the original trilogy of the Imperial Fighter to never get a figure scale release. Hasbro outdid themselves with their first release of this toy, putting it in that TIE Fighter blue that some OCD hand-wringers online find controversial and swear up and down all TIE Fighters are actually gray-white, even though ILM effects artist Lorne Peterson confirmed in Empire Strikes Back they were blue. Yes, we're well aware the TIE Bomber filming miniatures were white-gray and that the reflection of the blue screen when filming made them appear blue on screen. Well, guess what? That means they were blue in the movie, for better or worse, and the blue color is very much a Kenner-style trope for The Empire Strikes Back. And don't even start in on me about the die-cast version being white. Oh, hey look, blue TIE Fighters! I'm tired of listening to those people, so let's ride right past them on the way to get ice cream. You could argue this TIE Bomber toy is pushing into an area of detail in the sculpt that is past the Kenner aesthetic, and you wouldn't be wrong. Even still, this original release of the Bomber did adhere to one important Kenner standard: no weathering. Later releases of the toy, much like Hasbro's reissues of the Kenner vehicles themselves, would feature weathering deco. I've always found it interesting that even though Hasbro was releasing Kenner vehicles for Power of the Force 2 with new weathering details, their newly made vehicles that Kenner never got around to, like the T-16, the revised Vader TIE, and the TIE Bomber, were initially released clean. Then only on subsequent reissues were they given the weathered paint jobs. As if Hasbro was following some kind of established pattern or tradition with Star Wars toys, though I don't think this was a conscious decision, but a cosmic coincidence. Regardless, the original release of the TIE Bomber with the unmolested powder blue color feels like the lost Kenner TIE Fighter. And no, I wouldn't have been opposed to an all-white version of this toy without weathering to reflect the look of the original Kenner TIE Fighter. Alas, when they did a white version, they smacked it with all kinds of weathering deco, and it looks like crap. Imperial vehicles are always clean, and Rebel vehicles are weathered. Why Hasbro forgot this is just silly. What isn't silly is how it looks having these modern items integrated into your Kenner Star Wars displays. They really add a lot of context and fill long-standing infamous gaps in the vintage Star Wars toy line. Even if you're not a modern collector, Star Wars toys in the modern era have so many possibilities for your Kenner shelves. Don't discount them out of hand. Take your first step into a larger world.